There was an article.
Yeah, the first thing that we're going to do is we're just going to see who can pronounce the first word in the headline of the paper correctly today. And then from there, everything should be pretty downhill. But no, so today we're going to go over, it's a paper published in 2016. It's from the lab that I did my work in grad school, and it's a paper that I've really enjoyed and liked for a number of reasons. I think it has really interesting takeaways and implications with regards to both performance and then health and longevity. Because I think a lot of my thinking usually comes down to like, how can we help people be less fragile and more resilient? And I think the fragility and resiliency thing is super important, right? Because we were talking a little bit off air. It's like, if you're listening to this, or if you're one of our clients, you're not going to be in the boat that cares so much about either a highly specific performance outcome or cares so much about a highly specific physique outcome that you're willing just to mail in your health to make that happen. And those people exist. And like, if that's what your true purpose is and that's what you love, like, that's great, right? Like, I think that if you were to go and look at old interviews of like Thor, people in the strongman world, or you can even go back and obviously look at like super high level, very high drug using bodybuilding population over there. So you have people that are cognitively making the decision, like, I know this is not healthy and I don't really care. Because it's like, this is about me winning this thing that I'm super passionate about. I think that's great. I don't think people listening to this and our clients don't really fit that bill. It's like they want performance, but there's also a large layer of health underneath that with regards to setting yourself up to be really successful, less fragile, and more resilient, and just pretty much as unstoppable as we can make you for the next 5, 10, 15, 25, 30 plus years. Right. And so the paper today is pretty cool because we're going to get a little bit of insight into what that looks like at the level of the mitochondria, which is something I'm super interested in just from like a research and science standpoint. And so we're going to break this down and make it as layman term as possible for everybody. But there's like a really, really cool insight and takeaway from this paper. And so the paper, the way that you pronounce the first word is it's symmorphosis.
Nice.
Symmorphosis.
I didn't think you were gonna pump up the O there. That caught me off guard.
Yeah, I was breaking it down. Symmorphosis. I have to like say it in chunks personally, because otherwise it's just not good.
Yeah, it took me probably at least 60 seconds to get through the first word. This isn't a good start.
Yeah, we're not really going to like focus on the main takeaway from the paper. So the title of the paper is Symmorphosis and Skeletal Muscle VO2 Max in Vivo and in Vitro Measures Reveal Differing Constraints in the Exercise Trained and Untrained Human. That's great, right? So what they were really looking at, and I'll say this is from Gifford et al., 2016 in Journal of Physiology. We'll throw a link to this in the show notes so people can see it. I'll probably screen share some of the stuff here as we go. We're not going to focus so much on like the main point of the paper here, which is that symmorphosis concept, which just essentially says, and it talks about it here in the key points, right? It's predicting that the capacity of each step of the oxygen cascade is attuned to the task demanded of it. Simply meaning there's not going to be a single limiter. It's like the whole chain will fail simultaneously, right?
It's like the structure and the function are kind of matching essentially, right?
Exactly. It's like
the demand and the structure.
Neither is in excess of the other, right? So the concept would be that, hey, like, as we push someone towards VO2 max, we have this oxygen supply component, and take out the pulmonary. We're thinking primarily the cardiovascular system, right? The ability to supply oxygen down to the muscle, and then the ability to get that oxygen to the mitochondria, and the ability of the mitochondria then to utilize that oxygen to make ATP. The symmorphosis concept says that like that supply and then the utilization are going to be matched. And so they'll both fail at the same time. One will not be in excess of the other, right? I think that there's a lot of evidence in humans to show that that is not accurate, but we're not really going to focus on that. The thing that I want to focus on here is basically what they did. And so they brought in two groups of people. You had 10 young, healthy, untrained males, right? Untrained, essentially meaning that they have not undergone moderate to vigorous physical activity over the past 2 years. So they're very sedentary. And then we have 10 young, healthy, college-aged males who are pretty well aerobically trained, right? And knowing that this lab is in Salt Lake City, those people are really easy to find because road biking, mountain biking, cycling, cross-country skiing, like they're everywhere. It's huge. So finding like really well aerobically trained athletes and humans is like a pretty simple thing to do, okay? And so you have these two groups of people. One, again, both groups are young and healthy. That's like a really important point here. Both groups are currently young and healthy. One is trained, the other is not trained. And so what we did, or not what we did because I wasn't there, but what the researchers did here is they then took those two groups and had them do two different forms of exercise. So we had them do just a classic VO2 max test, like a ramp test on a bike, like a whole body VO2 max. And then you took that same group and had them do a VO2 max test in a single leg knee extension exercise. And so for people listening, it's not like a knee extension that you find at the gym. It's kind of like a single leg cycling thing where you're sitting in this chair and then your foot is in the boot and it runs back to a flywheel. So you're doing this very like cyclical, like kick, cycle back, kick, cycle back, kick, cycle back type exercise. Okay. So it's an incredibly aerobic thing. It's not a knee extension machine at the gym. And so you tested that for like that proposed VO2 max as well. Then they popped muscle biopsies from both groups. They took that mitochondria and you essentially take it through a procedure and then you put it in a respirometer. And all that really is saying is that we're going to see what's the true max capacity of the mitochondria itself. If I were to give it all the substrate it could ever need and all the oxygen it could ever need, how much can this thing go? Right? If you think of it like a car, if I was like, cool, I'm going to give this car all the fuel, everything it ever needs, and we're just going to put the gas pedal all the way down and see what this baby is truly capable of. That's basically what they did with the mitochondria and a respirometer. Okay. And so some of the findings here that are interesting, we'll break down the specifics here in a second. Like to be expected. Well, here, let me do this. I'll share my screen since I have that capacity so that anybody watching the video.
You're not rate limited by screen sharing?
Nice.
Huh?
You're not rate limited by screen sharing?
I don't think so. We're going to find out real quick if my my poopy Xfinity internet is going to rate limit me on my podcast like it did last Friday.
Poor Kieran.
But so this is the paper. Yeah, poor Kieran. Backstory for people. We don't need to go there. It's okay. We've discussed this.
Moving forward.
Moving forward. I put it behind me. I put it behind me.
I'm glad you did.
I did the thing that I was thinking about. I will say this one time. Do you remember like the I think it was the Kimbe Mutombo commercial where it's like people are trying to like shoot like a little paper ball into a basket and he's just not today.
Yep.
That was the thing that I had in the back of my mind when the episode ended. It's like every time you went to talk, I was interrupting you because I didn't know that you were actually there or speaking.
That's okay. It's
anyways,
like their normal life anyway.
That's true. That's true. But yeah, so if we break this down and look at it here, so this is figure one, right? We're just looking at cardiovascular and metabolic responses during knee extension exercise in the untrained and endurance trained populations. So as to be expected, right, the VO2 consumption in the trained population, which are the light gray circles, versus the dark circles, which are untrained, is far in excess. They have way more capacity. Obvious, right? Like trained or untrained, the trained population is going to have a higher VO2 max, okay? And then everything else downstream of that makes sense. The top figure here, A, is basically just the product of B and C. Because VO2, because of the Fick principle, is just essentially supply times the AVO2 difference. So if you look at femoral artery blood flow, we see higher blood flows in trained population. If we look at the AVO2 difference, they obviously eventually get to a higher AVO2 difference because they go longer. Okay,
Hey, James, real quick.
Yep.
Just because I think it'd be good just to explain that a little bit, the AVO2 difference. Like so that's just so you have arterial blood flow going to the muscle. There's oxygen in that blood.
Yep.
Essentially, it's getting dropped off at the muscle level of the mitochondria, and then some of that blood is leaving, and it's leaving either with or without oxygen.
Yes.
Right, and ending up in venous circulation. So it's that difference between the amount of oxygen being delivered to the muscle and then getting and then leaving the muscle after it's dropped off. Correct?
Exactly. Yeah. So if you want to think about measuring VO2, which is the volume of oxygen being consumed at the tissue, there are the two components to it. You have how much is actually showing up. That's your flow, right? That's the femoral artery blood flow in this figure here, panel B. And then you have what's being taken out of what's showing up. And that's the AVO2 difference, right? The easy example I like to mention to people is like, imagine that as like you had a balloon and you have a hose that runs by this balloon and things can diffuse from the hose into the balloon. and vice versa, right? So like if I have 100 units of something show up from the hose to the balloon, but then I measure it after it passes the balloon and there are only 40 units left, I know that 60 units got drawn out into the balloon. And that would be equivalent to like your AVO2 difference. And so the way this gets measured in a lab is you put in catheters. Well, the gold standard for this is you put in catheters. And so you actually have a direct measure of arterial blood coming in, and then you have a direct measure on the venous blood leaving the leg. So you know exactly how much showed up, you know what's leaving, and I know the difference. And so that's how we're going to get the VO2. It's like a very direct measure. Yeah. Is that, do you think was that good? Was that
great.
well explained?
That's
Everybody
great.
with me so far?
That was a good call.
Okay, beautiful. Yeah, pause me along the way because I want to make sure that this is useful for everybody listening. I don't leave people behind because some of this can get a little bit technical, and I think that I just oversee and forget that sometimes.
Not all of us have had 0.6% of PhD, James.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to give myself. I like to give myself a 70%.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe like a
Didn't mean
I'm
to
not
say
even
3/5.
sure I
short
can
there.
spell PhD.
Yeah, it's like I feel like a 3/5 is fair. Like I'm on 11 publications. I did all of my classes and got straight A's and everything. So I was done with all my coursework. Contributed to 11 publications, but have no letters. So it is what it is.
You're
That's
a doctor.
okay.
You're a doctor to me, James.
Yeah.
Thank you. That means the world to me, Mr. Wilson. So this is the first figure here that I think starts to get really interesting. And so this is where we're looking at the utilization of mitochondrial respiratory capacity during maximal knee extension exercise. All that these figures here are showing in panel A and then in panel B, we're really just concerned with, again, we have this process of needing to utilize oxygen, right? So I have blood flow coming down, delivering oxygen. Then I have the mitochondria itself that's going to be utilizing that oxygen when it shows up. And the question is, is one of those in excess of the other? Like, am I able to supply a whole bunch, but then my mitochondria can't handle it? Or can my mitochondria handle way more than I can get to it? Really important implications for both performance and health and longevity. And so what's interesting in panel A, if you looked at this like untrained versus trained group, what you see here is in like the dark shaded bar is the mitochondrial VO2 max. That was what was measured in the respirometer.
Outside of the body, like they've
Outside
taken
of the body,
muscle
they literally
biopsy.
pulled out the
Yep.
biopsy, got the mitochondria, put it in a respirometer, and measured this thing. And then the white bar is the knee extension VO2 max. So like what they actually achieved during exercise. And then the striped bar is the knee extension QO2 max, which is just the blood flow, like the max blood flow that was delivered into the quad through the femoral artery. Okay. And so it's incredibly interesting here. And if people are listening to this, they're like, you guys, you're totally losing me. Like, what's going on here? Like, we're recording this. There's a video, and I'm walking you through this with the graphs and panels. So you can go to YouTube and you can watch this. And we post this in our email list and we send it out. You have access to the video. So if I'm like totally losing you, go watch the video because I think it'd be super helpful.
Yep.
Or just keep hanging along here, and I'm going to get to the punchlines in a second, and we'll open for discussion. So what's interesting in the untrained group, what you see here is that the supply of like this striped line here is in excess of what the mitochondria could handle. And so the mitochondria, this dark bar, the shaded bar, is essentially serving as the ceiling of what's truly possible for the untrained group. They basically run into the ceiling of what the mitochondria can do, and then they're like, yep, I'm done. This is my max point. I cannot go any further. Like the mitochondria are limiting their capacity to continue to exercise and utilize more oxygen. The trained population is the polar opposite story, and this is what's super interesting. The trained population, the shaded bar is far in excess of what we can bring it. So the mitochondria have the capacity to handle way more than you can get to it. The thing that was limiting was your ability to supply enough blood and oxygen to the mitochondria, right? You guys with me so far? Is this making sense?
Yep.
Am I
Yeah.
doing a good job explaining
and,
this?
And the difference is so much in the trained versus untrained mitochondrial capacity that it's nearly double.
It's huge. It's an enormous
It looks
difference.
more like 3/5 to me, but yeah.
It's an enormous difference. But this is where panel B here is interesting, right? Because we're looking at essentially the delta with that knee extension VO2 max as a percentage of the mitochondrial VO2 max. And in the untrained population, I think it's at 95%. Like the mitochondrial VO2 max is at 95% of what the, measured exercise VO2 max is. In the trained population, it's only at like 65%. And so if you think about this, like they have a line drawn there at that 100 mark. And so I have this noted in like the paper and like the notes that I have. So that line there, I think is super interesting because that's basically your reserve capacity, right? So we can see here, we have an untrained group that has essentially zero reserve capacity left over. We have a trained group that has tons of reserve capacity left over. If we start thinking about, okay, obviously the trained group performs at a much higher level, but which of these groups has far greater variability and is going to be more resilient and less fragile? It's the group that has...
The trained group.
It's the group that has the reserve capacity. Okay, and we're going to talk about that more here in 1 second. Because the last figures to come down here and look at, which just ties this all together, is essentially just saying, okay, if we're going to look at this knee extension VO2 max or this whole body VO2 max, how tightly correlated is what's going on at the mitochondria with what happens, right? And so this is what's super intriguing, is that the knee extension VO2 max is like very tightly correlated in the untrained population with what the mitochondrial VO2 max is. In other words, the mitochondrial VO2 max is more or less predicting what their knee extension VO2 max will be. There's like almost zero predictive power in the trained group, right? Because it's far in excess. You're not running into the mitochondrial ceiling. The mitochondria is not the rate limiting step here. And then you see the same thing on the whole body VO2 max over here in figure 4, right? Again, super tight correlation on the mito VO2 max and the body VO2 max. There's nothing going on with that trained group and the whole body VO2 max, right? Again, go ahead.
Sorry, just like go way back. Sorry, the whole body VO2 max measurement is more like your traditional VO2
on a
type
bike
of measurement, right?
Measured at the mouth,
the respirometer kind of thing.
Yeah,
or that's what they're called. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, got it.
Yeah. So that's
a local. We basically have like a peripheral VO2 max, like we have like a local VO2 max at the quad, and then we have a systemic VO2 max that would be more your traditional kind of VO2 max testing.
Exactly. And so that's a really important
and
distinction.
One of those correlate for with mitochondrial capacity for trained individuals.
No, it does not. For trained individuals, there's no correlation between the whole body or the knee extension VO2 max with the mitochondrial VO2 max. But in the untrained population, it's super highly correlated because the mitochondria is essentially determining the limit of their capacity. Whereas in the trained population, the mitochondria is not determining the limit of their capacity. Okay. And so the reason that's an important distinction potentially like whole body versus single leg knee extension, it is like I'm looking at systemic VO2 max versus the VO2 max capabilities of a single muscle bed, which will be very different. And the reason that you use a model like this is because we know that during whole body exercise, like you're very likely going to be centrally limited. Like you're going to outstrip the pumping capacity of the heart. During single leg knee extension exercise, you're essentially decreasing demand everywhere else to as close to zero as you can. And it's only having to worry about supplying one active quad bed. And so that's where you're like, okay, cool. Maybe this will actually run me into like a hypothetical mitochondrial VO2 max where that's the limiter because I should be able to supply it with everything that I need. Right. But it's interesting that in both cases, both whole body and specific muscle belly, the untrained group is still being limited and dictated by what's going on at the mitochondria. Okay. And so we're talking about all this science jargon here, fam. And I know we're about 20 minutes in, and I hope that you're still with me and I didn't totally lose you. But I think this is super important because it really comes back to something that we talk about a good bit. Let me stop sharing that screen here. I think the big takeaway here that's super important is, again, I'm always thinking about like fragility and resilience in a human being. And at the end of the day, this ties in tightly with earlier podcast episode that we've run with Dr. Tommy Wood and Dr. Mike T, where we talked about this concept of a bioenergetic reserve, which looks to play a very, very large role in how good you are at responding to metabolic and stress insults, right? And what's interesting in this paper is that you have two young populations. So like these people that are young and untrained have not aged yet, but they're already showing their hand and already presenting like an aged population looks like. Right? Because what you see in an aged population is a very similar thing with the mitochondria, where they don't have as large reserve capacity. They don't deal with stress as well. And so they become more fragile because they have less variability of response. And so you're like getting a preview, you're getting a leading indicator here of even in a young, healthy college person that's been inactive for like 2 years. You're getting the leading indicator of like, they just don't have that reserve capacity in the mitochondria to appropriately manage and deal with stress well. Right. And so they have a section in this paper called Implications of a Mitochondrial Reserve Capacity, which is super important. Right. And what we know is that cells with a greater mitochondrial reserve capacity are more resistant to stress of like almost all kinds. So like when you're confronted with a metabolic challenge, these untrained subjects are going to have a very difficult time dealing with that. And there's a greater probability then of them showing outward manifestations of that stress, which is not a good thing. And so that's why I wanted to bring up this study, because I know that we talk a lot about conditioning and we talk a lot about aerobic endurance and capacity. But I think this is cool because this is actual real data, like showing the fact that, hey, like we need to do this. It's just another nugget feather in the hat of like, you have to be active, we have to train, we need to do these things. If you don't do them, you're going to be a very fragile, not resilient human. And that's just is what it is. Right? But yeah, let's open this up round table since we kind of, I think, hit all the big nuggets and stuff.
I mean, we could literally go anywhere, I suppose, because you have all sorts of various other systems where you need a reserve capacity. Like the first time I ever heard this concept was in the context of strength. Like if I'm really strong and I play a team sport athlete kind of game, I'm working at a lower percentage, maybe about 60% of my maximal capacity.
You mean 3/5?
I tried to hold off that.
That's going to be the title of the episode.
Anyways, so this reserve capacity allows you to work at these lower percentages, and therefore, just to go back to the car analogy, when you drive your car, you don't floor it the whole time because the engine will wear out. But if you work at, a lower percentage of your what you can actually do, your car's going to last a really long time.
Yeah, I think that's a very useful analogy for people to tie this together.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You kind of have to think about what your operating capacity is. Like how hard is your underlying system having to work at baseline? And then how hard is it having to work with deal with stress? Because you're going to see stress. You're going to have metabolic demand that increases and decreases. You're going to have other things that are going to be going on, right? Like if you have like a detoxification pathway, for example, like a detoxification pathway needs ATP to function. So you have to upregulate mitochondria to supply more ATP to a detoxification pathway to deal with whatever that stress may be. Right. So
now you have the flexibility to do that.
You have to have the flexibility to do that. Right. Like the reason I come back to the mitochondria and all this is because I don't know if there is a more essential thing than your capacity to create energy. Like,
yeah, it's ubiquitous.
It's the thing. Like if you don't have energy, you literally cannot be alive. There are a lot of other things that can kind of go wrong. But if you can't meet the energetic demand, you're dead. Like,
yeah.
And so this is where this stuff is so important because it has implications not only for your performance, right? It's like we want you to be able to perform at a high level, to be physically unstoppable. It's like I want you to be able to go and ruck in the mountains or maybe go do a 5K or like jump on an assault bike and like display the fact that you have good aerobic capacity, endurance, and power. But the thing that's really cool here, what you need to know is that because you can do those things, it's making you way more resilient and less fragile over the long run, and your ability just to deal with other forms of stress and insult.
Yeah, one of the things it mentioned here that was pretty interesting was just more resistant to oxidative stress, defects as a result of the mitochondrial toxins, cell death, all that stuff. That's a really cool piece just to talk about, to your point, like not just the performance and like staying in your aerobic window or whatever, but also like just your long-term health and being able to deal with those.
Yeah, at first to me, it seemed kind of strange because it's not like putting more mito into the muscle is free, right? It's like there's an energetic cost to that. It's actually laying down these new mitochondria, but it does make sense in that regard. It's like you like Lance is saying, like you don't want to just be functioning at exactly as much as you need. Like you want to have that reserve available, and that probably comes with less stress in the long run than that amount of energetic demand and kind of creating this these extra structures. I had some kind of like obscure questions if you are interested in like
Please.
entertaining me.
Yeah, let's do it.
So my, like the one thing that I was thinking like right off the bat is because, I won't say that nobody likes cardio. Some people do, but a lot of people don't. And I'm wondering if like in the beginning, do we even really need to do cardiovascular training in the traditional sense, or can we do something else that's going to increase the mitochondrial capacity at like the local level? Although as I'm saying that sounds kind of stupid because like we really want, it's not like we just want mitochondria in our quads, right? Like we probably want this whole body increase. Like, so, I mean, does it work that way? Like if you were to cycle, like you're getting, obviously anyone who's done cycling has that your heart rate increases to a significant degree, and maybe that has to do with just like byproducts of muscular contraction and buffering and that type of stuff driving the respiration at the local level. And you're not like, hopefully you're not using your arms a whole lot while you're cycling, unless you're using something like an Airdyne bike. But does it work that way? Like, at what point is it super local, and does that still have the same effect? Like, if you theoretically just lay down more mitochondria in your quads, would that have the same effect on this reserve capacity that we're talking about?
That's a really good question.
Could you even do that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'm not sure that I am confident enough to give you a really good answer on a local adaptation and its impact systemically. I'm not sure. Like that would be a really interesting. I would have to dig into that, right?
Because I think of like their last conversation with BFR, right? It's like could you just BFR somebody in at bed rest? Like, I mean, you see hypertrophic benefits to that. So maybe you could see the same thing in terms of like cellular respiration.
My guess is like if you took a cyclist, for example, like the predominant training adaptation is going to be taking place at the heart and in the lower half, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I were to compare them to somebody. So that's a good question. I'm not sure, right? Like,
so I have some thoughts.
Yeah, go ahead and kick that off.
If we think about the hypothetical, sorry, I'm not even facing the mic. If you think about the hypothetical person that you're talking about, in my experience, it's more important that they just come to the gym. Because if you're that detrained, you don't train and you need to start training. And so the habit is probably more important than any physiology. And if you think about it, habit aside, training wise, like we've all worked with people who have never worked out before. They're sore when they go up the stairs, for 3 days afterwards. So you could probably do anything. And even more so, like if they're bed rest kind of untrained, like you're saying, you'd probably get more mitochondrial density out of some blood flow restriction, I would think. But as you get more and more trained, like James lays in the bed with that, he's probably not going to get a whole lot out of that because he is trained.
Yeah. So at that point, like that's going to be the adaptation kind of regardless of what we do. If you're,
I would think you'd get really general adaptation from essentially anything early on. And then as you're more advanced, you have to be really specific about what you're training.
Yeah. It's like, I don't know if you look at like a more trained population, like if you took someone, you take like a CrossFit athlete and then you take a cyclist, right? Like one's going to have a greater adaptation locally and the other's probably going to have a greater adaptation systemically. Like, do you see a significant difference between the two? Because at one level, it's like the cyclist will clearly be far more resilient than just like a layperson who's not active, not doing stuff. But I'm not sure about what that looks like from a local and then systemic change standpoint. My guess is that you're getting both, Like my guess is that when you're on a bike going, you're getting both local and systemic changes. I think most of the literature would show that like that population tends to be pretty resilient
Mhm.
when you start actually popping biopsies and looking at stuff. So I do think that it can't, maybe here's the easiest way to say it, it can't hurt. Like it's not going to make you worse. Right. But
Yep.
I'm not sure if we compared two populations, one was like doing like whole body stuff and the other was doing things more local. What's that going to look like? I'm not positive. I mean, that's kind of why we do both. Right. It's like we have people row, we have people cycle, we have people run, we have people assault bike. Like we're kind of training you systemically for that reason. Like we're trying to prepare you unanimously so that nothing you face in life from a physical standpoint, it's going to be a problem. Yeah, but that's a good question. I don't know if I even answered what you were asking.
Yeah, like I said, an obscure question. I wasn't expecting to have a definitive answer, but just like I just think it's an interesting idea and thought. But I think it does. This whole thing does speak to just being a little bit more well-rounded and just like there's going to be costs to anything that you do, any stressor that you put on your body, right? But if we can limit the general costs, I think that's probably going to be better. Again, like my head always goes to hypertrophy and strength stuff, but it's like if I don't have to create this huge systemic demand because I'm a little bit better conditioned, I can probably get the more specific adaptation that I'm going for. I think there becomes a time, which is always funny to me when regardless of the fact that the literature has kind of teased us out at this point, like that interference effect is only really going to happen if it's like really crazy amounts of aerobic training. But it's always funny to me that a lot of these people still have this fear of doing aerobic training and that it's going to ramp up AMPK.
Yeah.
I know you love that conversation, James, because it is that simple. Of course, you turn on AMPK and you turn it off. It's a light switch. You can see it actually inside the muscle. It gets darker.
It looks like a light
and
bug.
brighter.
It's like one of those lightning bugs, like the fireflies. Yeah, the fireflies out here. When you look at a cell under a microscope, it's literally just
AMPK.
It's a little AMPK. They just light up and they turn off. They light off.
Yeah, that's completely how it works. It is that simple. Everything in human physiology is that simple. Yeah, like they're afraid to do this because they're afraid that's going to impair their gains. But it's like, dude, your whole workout is a cardiovascular work. Like you do bicep curls and it's a cardiovascular workout because you were so deconditioned. Like you just did a little bit of cardio, like you would actually probably get a lot more out of that training in acutely, like during your session, and then there wouldn't be as much of a demand afterwards either. It wouldn't be as much of a cost. And that's I mean, I can't prove that, but just looking at what's happening when you watch these people, you can see it in the drop off and from set to set, or just their ability to get through an entire workout, how long it takes. Like all of that stuff has a cost. So it's interesting, but I don't think you need to be super high level of aerobic fitness in order to get those benefits. But
Yeah.
it's I think this is just like another point in that of saying, hey, this is actually helpful.
Yeah, you need to do your conditioning, right? I think
Yeah.
the other point we've made in a
At least
podcast
some.
before, it's like walking's great, but like if you're listening to this, walking is not the goal here, right? Like we're not talking to a very
Yeah, that's
detrained
not gonna do it.
population that's not doing stuff. Like that's just not who we're talking to here, right? Like walking can be a movement goal, but it's not your exercise or your endurance goal. It's like you
Yeah,
need to be doing your conditioning. It doesn't need to like be crazy. It doesn't need to be elaborate and all this like, but you need to be doing it, right?
Yeah,
You need to be doing
caloric
some type of
expenditure
aerobic capacity,
different.
aerobic endurance work. Like it's just too essential to not be doing it. And I think I mentioned this once we hung up yesterday with Chris. That would have been super interesting to see in a study like this is if you bring in different types of populations and do the same thing. Like if I bring in an aerobically trained group, I bring in like a bodybuilder, I bring in power lifters, I bring in like a CrossFitter, and then I bring in more of just like a strength conditioning athlete. Like look at what those things look like. If I take like we'll just call it like a very classic body power lifter, like I see when I go out to the gym here in Knoxville sometimes, like I'm there for 75 minutes and I do an entire workout and get a lot of volume in. And like the dudes hit 3 sets of squats. And the entire time that I've been there, it's like he hits 2 reps. It's like, huh. And he like walks and sits down, like, and then I'm like,
Have a snack.
Yeah, it's like, does that person look like the untrained individual in this study?
Mm.
My assumption, my guess would be like the powerlifting population that does it that way would probably look a lot like that untrained group, and that's not a good thing. Right? Like maybe the bodybuilder doesn't, because the fact you're at higher reps, you do get some metabolic stress.
Yes.
Like we'd maintain some of that stuff a little bit better. But I think looking at those would be an interesting thing, and I'm not positive, right? But again, we kind of pick on that population a little bit sometimes, just because I think I have like a different viewpoint. Like my goal is not to just like squat, bench, and deadlift as much weight as humanly possible and like fuck everything else. If that is your goal, then yeah, like this is the trade-off, and that's fine. You just have to be aware of that.
Even then, there's a difference between being highly advanced in powerlifting and being somebody who's really just a software engineer who likes to work out, right? And might do powerlifting competitions. The people who deadlift 800, 900 pounds, like your muscle is churning through ATP when you do that. But if you train like that person and you only deadlift 400 pounds, you're not like, you might be operating at a almost supra physiological level for you right now, but not for humans in general. So my old boss, Mike Robertson, told me when I was first training under him, he was like, I was doing powerlifting, and he was like, I was like, do I need to do this part of the workout? He goes, man, once you start squatting 6 bills, I'll let you skip the conditioning. It's like, you need that and it reminds me of just the whole, pyramid idea of, I need to build up a base that supports building on, maybe more niche or specialized adaptations on the top of the pyramid. And conditioning is that, and higher endurance stuff is that. And I would say, when I watch someone like Brian Shaw on YouTube doing the ergo rower thing and just doing long durations, at least for people like us, I guess, but long durations of cardio, high intensity cardio, and just demolishing any sort of rate that I could achieve. It's like, oh, well, I might be conditioned, but he is also conditioned, even though he's really freaking strong.
Yeah. Doesn't seem to be stopping him either, right?
No, exactly.
I mean, I think strongman as a population gets enough variability in their training. Like you have to be able to do medleys. Like you got to be able to do moving events, and like you got to be able to do multiple events in a day. So it's like you can't just be like super strong and then totally deconditioned. Yeah. You're going to get crushed. Right. Yeah. And we're not trying to call it any population here. I think it's just, we can sum this up here because we're kind of reaching the end of the time. The takeaway here, guys, is just like, again, trying to harp on and bring more, maybe some reason and evidence and cool science that I think is cool, at least, to the table, just to continue to try to educate you and talk about things that you need to do to make yourself as anti-fragile, resilient, and just physically unstoppable as possible. And the conditioning component is obviously a huge one here. And this is just like one small snapshot of evidence for that. But again, I just thought it was a cool paper. Hopefully people enjoyed it. We'll throw links to it in the show notes. Any closing thoughts from the team here? That's looking like a no. Okay.
I think we nailed it.
Kieran, why don't you close us out, since I like, you didn't get to talk for the last 30 minutes of the one that we did last week. So bring us home.
No, it's just a good reminder that a little variability is probably going to be a good thing long term. If your only option is to redline everything you do, probably not great for your performance, and probably even worse for your health. So being able to operate at a lower percentage for most of the time, or having options at least, is probably a little better option overall.
I love it. We'll close with that. Have a fantastic week, folks. And we will be back next Monday. All right. Talk soon.